She didn't say it during an argument. That would have been easier to understand. She said it casually, almost lazily, while sitting across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. My friends think I settled. I looked at her. She didn't look up. Then she added, "They think I could have done much better." There are sentences that make you angry. And then there are sentences that make something inside you go completely still. I put my coffee down. For almost 8 years, I had been building a life with this woman. I had paid the mortgage, covered the emergencies, remembered the birthdays, supported her career, and quietly built a financial future neither of us needed to worry about. But apparently, none of that counted. Because I wasn't impressive enough. I could have argued. I could have opened my laptop and shown her the account she barely knew existed. I could have told her about the company I'd invested in 3 years earlier, the one that had just been acquired. I could have shown her the documents my attorney had sent me that week. I could have told her that the man she thought was merely comfortable was actually sitting on opportunities worth more than anything her friends had been showing off about. Instead, I looked at her and said 4 words. Then go find better. She finally stopped scrolling. And for the first time that night, she looked directly at me. She had no idea what those words were going to cost her. And she had even less idea what they were going to cost me. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my life, I've believed that the things worth having are built quietly. I grew up in a small town outside Denver. My father repaired commercial heating systems. My mother worked at the same public library for nearly 3 decades. We weren't wealthy. We weren't struggling either. We simply understood the difference between having money and having security. My father used to say something whenever I complained about not having what other kids had. Don't chase what people can see. Build what they can't take away. I didn't understand what he meant when I was 12. I understood it by the time I was 30. I went to Colorado State on a scholarship, worked nights, and eventually moved into technology consulting. The first decade of my career wasn't glamorous. There were years when I worked 70-hour weeks. There were months when I wondered whether I'd made the right choice. But slowly things changed. I became a director, then a partner. Then I started investing. Not flashy investments. No sports cars. No expensive watches. I invested in people. Small technology companies. Healthcare startups. Software businesses whose founders were smart enough to build something, but not yet wealthy enough to attract serious capital. Most failed. A few survived. One became very successful. And another eventually became the investment that changed my financial life. But I didn't tell everyone, including my wife. Not because I was hiding money from her. I simply never thought of money as something you announced. My wife, Claire, saw things differently. I met Claire at a charity event in 2019. She was 30 when we met. I was 35. She worked in brand strategy for a luxury home company, and she had the kind of personality that made strangers feel like old friends. She was funny, confident, beautiful, and when she looked at you, she made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. I wasn't looking for marriage. I'd already had one serious relationship that ended badly, and I'd decided that I wasn't going to force anything. Then Claire happened. For the first 2 years, she was everything I wanted. We traveled. We cooked together. We spent Sunday mornings walking through farmers' markets. She would steal my coffee and complain that I made it too strong. I loved that about her. We eventually bought a house together outside the city. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't the kind of house that appeared in magazines. It was a beautiful old property with a large backyard and enough space for the life we imagined having. I renovated most of it myself. Claire chose the furniture. I loved watching her turn empty rooms into something that felt like us. We got married in a small ceremony surrounded by family. And for a while, everything was good. Then came the friends. More specifically, one friend. Her name was Madison. Madison had married a private equity executive and had somehow turned every part of her life into a competition. Where she vacationed, what she wore, what restaurant she visited, what car her husband drove, what neighborhood they lived in. At first, Claire's fascination seemed harmless. She'd come home and say things like, "Madison and Eric are going to Italy next month." Or, "They're thinking about buying a place in Aspen." I never cared. People are allowed to spend their money however they want. But slowly, Claire stopped talking about Addison's life as something interesting. She started talking about it as something we were supposed to match. Eric surprised her with a new car. Madison said they never fly commercial anymore. Apparently, everyone in their circle has a vacation property now. I would laugh and say, "Sound expensive." Claire stopped laughing with me. Instead, she'd say, "You don't understand." I asked her what I didn't understand. She said, "It's not about the money." But it was always about the money. The watch, the restaurant, the hotel, the neighborhood, the clothes, the people. Everything became a measurement. And eventually, I realized I was the measurement. One night, Claire came home from dinner with Madison and two other women. She put her purse down and said, "Do you know what Madison's husband bought her for their anniversary?" "No." "A necklace. Nice." "Ethan, it was almost $70,000. I looked at her. She waited. I said, "That's a lot of money for a necklace." She sighed. "That's exactly what I mean." "What do you mean?" "You always make everything sound excessive." I didn't know how to respond. Because I wasn't criticizing the necklace. I just didn't understand why I was supposed to care. A few weeks later, she asked why I still drove my 5-year-old SUV. I told her it worked perfectly. She said, "That's not the point." Again, that phrase, "That's not the point." The point was always something I couldn't see. Or perhaps something I refused to see. Then one evening she told me Madison had called me understated. I laughed. Claire didn't. "She meant it as an insult," Claire said. "Why?" "She thinks you're hiding behind being modest." That one stayed with me. Because I suddenly realized Claire had started believing that my lack of display meant my lack of achievement. She knew my salary. She knew we owned our home. She knew I invested. But she didn't know how much. She didn't know what was sitting in accounts I'd built before we met. She didn't know what my investments were worth. She didn't know that a company I'd invested in had just received an acquisition offer. And she definitely didn't know that I'd spent the previous 6 months negotiating a new investment partnership that could eventually become the most important professional move of my life. I wasn't keeping it secret. I simply hadn't felt the need to turn our marriage into a financial presentation. That was my mistake. Because while I was quietly building, Claire was quietly comparing. And eventually, the comparisons became cruel. One Saturday morning she asked, "Why don't you ever want to upgrade your life?" I looked around our kitchen. "What exactly needs upgrading?" She gestured around. "Everything." That hurt, not because the kitchen was expensive, because I'd built it. I'd chosen that house. I'd spent years making it comfortable. And suddenly, the life I'd thought we were proud of had become embarrassing to her. I asked her whether she was unhappy. She said, "I don't know." I asked whether she loved me. She said, "That's not fair." I didn't ask again. The final conversation happened on a rainy Thursday night. I had spent the entire day in meetings with two founders. One of them was asking me to lead their next funding round. I came home late. I was wearing an old jacket I'd owned for years. Claire was sitting at the counter with her phone in her hand. She barely looked up. "You're late." Meeting ran long. Of course. I knew immediately something was wrong. I put my keys down. "What happened?" She didn't answer. She kept scrolling. Then she said, "Madison thinks you're holding me back." I stared at her. From what? From having the life I should have. I waited. She finally looked up. "Ethan, you're a good man." Whenever someone starts a sentence that way, you already know the rest isn't going to be good. "But you're not ambitious enough." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so completely wrong. She had no idea. She had absolutely no idea what was happening behind the scenes. She didn't know I'd just received the final term sheet for the largest investment I'd ever made. She didn't know my attorney had already prepared documents for the new partnership. She didn't know that the acquisition of one of my companies was days away from being announced. She only knew what she could see. The old SUV. The simple clothes. The quiet house. The man who didn't need to tell everyone what he had. Then she said the sentence that ended our marriage. "My friends think I could do better." I felt something inside me settle. Not break. Settle. Like a decision that had been waiting for permission. I looked at her and said, "Then go." She blinked. "What?" "Go find better." She stared at me as if she'd expected an argument. Maybe she wanted me to fight. Maybe she wanted me to prove her friends wrong. Maybe she wanted me to suddenly become the man she thought would impress them. But I wasn't going to audition for my own Maria. Gee. She looked down at her phone again. "Fine." I nodded. "Fine." Then I walked upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how to save our marriage. I was thinking about how to leave it with dignity. The next morning I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my financial advisor. The second was to my attorney. The third was to the event planner who had been helping me organize Claire's upcoming birthday. I'd been planning a surprise trip for months. A private villa. A week near the coast. A dinner with our closest friends. And a custom piece of jewelry she'd once told me she dreamed of owning. I canceled everything. Not to punish her. Because I finally understood something. You don't keep pouring your heart into a place that has already decided it doesn't want what you're giving. My attorney told me to slow down. Don't make decisions because you're angry. I'm not angry, I said. That's what concerns me. He was right. I wasn't angry. I was clear. For 3 days, Claire said nothing. She acted as if the conversation had never happened. That was almost worse. Then, on the 4th morning, she walked into the kitchen and said, "Are we seriously not going to talk about this?" I looked at her. "We already did." "No, we didn't. You told me your friends think you can do better." I was upset. "You said it." "I didn't mean it like that." I nodded. Maybe. She sat down. Are you really going to throw away our marriage over one conversation? I looked at her for a long moment. No. She seemed relieved. Then I finished. I'm not throwing it away. I'm accepting what you told me about it. She didn't know what to say. And that was the moment I knew there was no going back. But I still didn't know the whole truth. I didn't know where Claire had been going. I didn't know who Madison had been introducing her to. And I certainly didn't know what had happened at the birthday dinner that would eventually make Claire call me from the middle of the night. That phone call was coming. And when it did, I would finally understand why Claire had been so eager to convince herself that I wasn't enough. Because someone else was waiting in the background. And he thought she was already available. At 3:42 in the morning, my phone started vibrating on the nightstand. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name. Sophie, Claire's closest friend. She had never called me at that hour. I answered. Hello. There was silence. Then I heard her crying. Ethan. What's wrong? I didn't know who else to call. I sat up. Is Claire okay? Another pause. She is. Then what's happened? Sophie took a breath. It was her birthday dinner. I already knew about the dinner. Claire had been getting ready for hours. Madison had organized everything. I hadn't been invited. Or rather, I had been invited indirectly, and then somehow disappeared from the plan. I had stayed home. Sophie continued. There was a man there. I didn't say anything. His name is Grant. Who is Grant? He's a real estate developer. Madison knows him. I stared at the darkness. Okay. Sophie started crying harder. Ethan, I think Claire was expecting him. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. But I let her continue. He sat beside her. And they talked all night. I closed my eyes. Did they leave together? No. A pause. But that's not the worst part. What is? Sophie lowered her voice. I heard Claire tell Madison that she was finally ready to move on. I felt the same strange calm I'd felt in the kitchen. Not anger. Not jealousy. Just clarity. What exactly did she say? Sophie hesitated. She said she had been unhappy for a long time. I laughed quietly. Not because it was funny. Because suddenly, the last 2 years made sense. The comparisons. The criticism. The friends. The constant pressure to become someone else. It wasn't about the watch. It wasn't about the car. It wasn't even about money. She had already decided I wasn't the man she wanted. She just needed a reason that sounded impressive enough to explain it. Sophie said, Ethan, I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. I should have told you sooner. Maybe. She cried again. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. Madison told Claire that you would never give her the kind of life Grant could. I looked across the bedroom. The room was quiet. Claire's side of the bed was empty. She'd been sleeping in the guest room for weeks. I asked, did Claire believe her? Sophie was silent. Then she said, I think she wanted to. That was the answer. The divorce process started 2 weeks later. There were no screaming matches. No broken furniture. No dramatic confrontations. Just paperwork. Lawyers. Bank statements. Property agreements. Appointments. The strangest part was how ordinary everything felt. Claire seemed surprised. I think she expected me to fight. She expected anger. She expected me to beg. Instead, I agreed to separate. Lee. When she asked why I wasn't trying harder, I reminded her of the kitchen. You said you could do better. She looked down. I was wrong. I believe she regretted saying it. But regret isn't the same thing as love. And by then, I had learned the difference. The divorce took nearly a year. During that time, Claire and I barely spoke unless something required it. She eventually moved into an apartment downtown. I stayed in our house. I didn't want another woman. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to prove anything. I wanted quiet. And for the first time in years, I had it. Then the business deal closed. The company I'd invested in was acquired. My return was far larger than I'd expected. The new investment partnership also became official. Suddenly, people who had never paid attention to me started calling. Business magazines wanted interviews. Founders wanted meetings. Investors wanted introductions. I declined most of it. I didn't suddenly become interested in showing people what I had. If anything, the experience had made me more private. Then one afternoon, my brother called. Have you seen Madison's post? No. You should. He sent me a screenshot. It was from Claire's birthday dinner. A group photo. Claire was smiling. Madison was beside her. And sitting across from Claire was Grant. The caption talked about new beginnings. Leaving behind what no longer serves you. Choosing the life you deserve. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I noticed the comments. Someone had posted a link. It was an article about emerging investors in our region. My photograph was there. My name. My company. The acquisition. The investment partnership. Everything. One comment underneath said, "Wait, isn't this Claire's husband?" The comment had received dozens of replies. People were suddenly asking questions. Who was I? How much had I invested? Why had Claire left? Why had she been saying she needed a more successful husband? Madison deleted the post. But it was too late. Screenshots had already spread. My brother called again. You okay? Yeah. You don't sound surprised. I'm not. Doesn't it feel good? I thought about that. No. Because the truth was, I didn't want Claire to discover my worth after leaving me. I wanted her to know it while she was with me. That was the part people misunderstood. This wasn't about money. It never had been. Money was simply the easiest thing for her to measure. A watch can be measured. A car can be measured. A house can be measured. But loyalty can't. Patience can't. Sacrifice can't. Love can't. And those were the things she'd overlooked. A few months after the divorce, Sophie contacted me. She asked if we could meet. We sat at a small cafe downtown. She told me Grant and Claire had dated for about 2 months. Then it ended. Apparently, Grant had never been interested in a serious relationship. Claire had believed she was moving toward the life she'd wanted. Instead, she discovered that the person she thought represented that life didn't actually want to build one with her. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Then Sophie said something that stayed with me. She thought you'd fight harder. I looked at her. What do you mean? She thought you would panic. Why? Because she thought you needed her more than she needed you. I was quiet. Sophie stirred her coffee. When you didn't fight, she realized she might have misunderstood everything. I nodded. Maybe she had. But by then, it didn't matter. I went home that night and walked through the house. The dining room still had the table Claire had chosen. The living room still had the sofa she'd loved. There were photographs on the wall, memories everywhere. For the first time, they didn't feel like evidence of what I'd lost. They felt like evidence of what I'd survived. I started changing small things. Not dramatically. I moved furniture, painted one room, turned the spare bedroom into an office, put my father's old workbench in the garage. Slowly, the house became mine again. Not because Claire had been erased, but because I stopped living around her absence. I also started spending more time with my parents. My father was getting older. He still repaired things around the house himself, even though he didn't need to. One Sunday, I told him what had happened. He listened. Then he said, "You know what your mother always cared about." "What?" "Whether I came home." I smiled. He continued, "She didn't care what car I drove. She didn't care what other men earned. She cared whether I kept my word." I didn't say anything. He looked at me. "That's what matters." I thought about the sentence for days. Because my father was right. I'd spent months thinking about whether Claire had been wrong about my success. But maybe that wasn't the important question. Maybe the real question was whether I had been wrong about her. And the answer was yes. I had mistaken admiration for understanding. I had assumed that because someone loved the life we were building, they also valued the person building it. They didn't always. Sometimes people love what your life provides them, not necessarily who you are. That's a painful distinction, but an important one. A few months later, Sophie called again. She told me Madison's friend group had changed. People had stopped spending as much time together. The constant competition had become exhausting. Sophie herself had walked away. She said she had realized she was spending too much energy trying to look happy instead of actually being happy. I told her that sounded healthy. She laughed. "You know what the weirdest part is?" "What?" "I used to think you were boring." I laughed. "Thank you." "No, listen." She smiled. "I thought you were boring because you didn't need everyone to know what you were doing." I understood. That was exactly it. The loudest person in the room isn't necessarily the most successful. The person with the expensive watch isn't necessarily the wealthiest. The person posting the perfect vacation may be miserable. And the person wearing an old jacket may be quietly building something extraordinary. I stopped trying to prove that. That's probably the most important thing that happened after the divorce. I stopped trying to prove myself. To Claire, to Madison, to anyone. I still wear the same old jacket. I still drive a practical car. I still don't post my financial life online. The investment partnership is doing well. Some deals succeed. Some fail. That's business. But my life is different now. Quieter. Better. I have dinner with my parents every Sunday. I spend time with my brother. I travel when I want to. I work because I enjoy building things, not because I need anyone's approval. And eventually, I started dating again. Not immediately. I wasn't interested in replacing Claire. I wanted to understand what I'd done wrong before I tried to build something new. The biggest mistake wasn't staying too long. It wasn't hiding my finances. It wasn't ignoring Madison. My biggest mistake was believing I needed to convince someone of my value. You can't. If someone has already decided that your worth depends on what you display, no amount of displaying will ever be enough. There will always be a newer car, a bigger house, a more expensive vacation, a richer friend, a better-looking stranger. The finish line keeps moving. But when someone values the right things, you don't have to keep running. You can simply live. Claire eventually sent me a message. It was short. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been influenced by people who cared too much about appearances. She said she had realized too late that she had been measuring the wrong things. I read it twice. Then I put my phone down. I didn't hate her. I didn't forgive her either. Not because I was bitter. Because forgiveness doesn't require reopening a door. Sometimes you can wish someone well from very far away. That's what I did. I wished her well. Then I went outside. It was early morning. The street was quiet. The sun was coming up behind the houses. And for some reason, I thought about that night in the kitchen. Her phone. My coffee. Her words. My answer. Then go find better. At the time, I thought those words were about her. Now I understand they were about me. I had spent years trying to be impressive enough, successful enough, patient enough, generous enough. I kept asking myself what I needed to become so someone would finally see my value. But I had been asking the wrong question. The question wasn't, how do I become enough for someone else? It was, why am I trying to become someone else at all? My father had given me the answer years earlier. Build what people can't take away. So I did. Not a bigger house. Not a more expensive watch. Not a life designed for photographs. I built character. I built independence. I built relationships with people who cared about who I was when nobody was watching. And most importantly, I built a life I didn't need anyone's permission to enjoy. That's what Claire couldn't see. And that's what I finally learned. Some people will only value you when other people tell them you're valuable. Let them. Some people will leave because they think they can find something better. Let them go. Because the right person won't need a price tag to understand your worth. They'll notice how you treat people, how you keep your promises, how you show up when things get difficult, how you behave when nobody is watching. Those are the things that matter. Those are the things that last. And if someone looks at all of that and still says you're not impressive enough, don't spend your life trying to change their mind. Sometimes the strongest answer isn't revenge. It isn't success. It isn't proving them wrong. Sometimes the strongest answer is simply, then go. And when they do, let them. Because the life you build after you stop chasing someone's approval may finally become the life you were supposed to have all along.